We're going to talk about 6 proven studs that have some warning signs you should not ignore heading into 2024. All right, Chris, let's talk about a player who was the #1 player in all of fantasy just 2 years ago, and now you may not want to touch him.
Yeah, Cooper Kupp has some major red flags, some major warning signs that you definitely do not want to ignore. And let's start with, I guess, the really obvious one, and that's the injury history. And since injuring his ankle in 2022, he's only played 50% of the Rams games. I mean, right there, you're not getting what you want out of a guy. You don't want a guy who's only going to play 50% of the games. And it's not like he's a spring chicken here, like a young guy where you can say, well, he had some bad luck, he can bounce back. He's going to be 31 years old in June. This could just be the new norm for Cooper Kupp, where if you have Cooper Kupp, you're always dealing with the fact that, oh, hey, he's limping to the sidelines. They're checking his ankle. Oh, he's going to miss a couple games with the ankle or a hamstring or whatever it might be. I mean, he's 31. This is just kind of how it works in sports with the human body. It's a sad thing, but it's true. But even beyond the injury part, there's other major red flags here. Namely, he's not getting the target share we saw when he was the #1 player in all of fantasy. Last year, he only had double-digit targets in 4 out of 12 games. You go back to the year before, when he only played 9 games, he had 5 games with at least double-digit targets, and the year before that, he was getting double-digit targets, it seemed like, every single week. The big reason? Oh, this guy named Puka Nacua, this rookie who, one of the best rookie wide receivers we've ever seen as far as production goes in the NFL. He's going to be entering year 2. He might be the #1 wide receiver in this offense. He was last year. Why not next year? And that means now Cooper Kupp, to go with the injury, may miss games, may be banged up, isn't even going to be the target monster he was prior when we saw him winning leagues and being the best fantasy player. I know you're going to see the name Cooper Kupp. You're going to think of years past. You're going to think of the glory years when he was an absolute stud carrying fantasy teams. But please, don't ignore the red flags here. It happens in the NFL. The cliff comes quick. Certainly a guy you need to be wary of in 2024.
Now, when it comes to drafting a running back, sometimes it's just nice to have a known commodity, a guy who's been proven to be productive. He's in a good offense. And I'll tell you what, Joe Mixon is a player, we talked about last year. We both had some concerns. There were some red flags. And he went out and he had a pretty good season. But how good was it really? Was it that he was much more effective, or was he just out there a lot and just, by sheer attrition at the position, wound up being one of the better scorers? Look, he wasn't an RB1 for fantasy. Let's get out of the way first, right? He wasn't elite. You weren't winning your league because you had Joe Mixon last year. But he did bump his rushing average up from 3.9 yards per carry the year before up to 4.0. So good for him. Got a little bit more efficient. He did get 1,000 yards in the ground, just barely. So good for that 17th game. Look, I don't want to rip on Mixon. Sure, he's been solid for years. He is in a good offense. But let's face it, he's more, maybe not a plotter, but let's just say he's getting his fantasy points just through sheer volume. But what if that changes next year? Here's a warning sign. Besides the fact that, he's now a year older, there's going to be a new offensive coordinator in town. Brian Callahan gone to be head coach of Tennessee. Maybe he doesn't go with the workhorse approach. Maybe young running back Chase Brown, who showed some flashes of being a burner, which Mixon is not anymore, maybe Chase Brown does get more involved on a regular basis. Look, maybe Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase actually stay healthy all year and they can pass it more like they want to. We'll see if that happens. Like, there's just a lot of little things conspiring to make Mixon just a little notch lower each year. And so he didn't really take a step back in 2023, but he didn't take a step up either. And I don't think another year of experience is going to help a running back who may get spelled even more frequently next year. So I'm not anti-Mixon like I was last year, but at the same time, I guarantee someone will draft him way before I would consider it, just based on name value alone, and that's not how you play fantasy football. It's about upside, not about name value. All right, speaking of, there's another great, or should I say once great RB that may not be that next year.
Yeah, speaking of kind of declining, that has been Derrick Henry the last few years. 3 years ago, he was an absolute monster. Averaged over 24 points per game. But you look at the last 2 years, 18 points per game in 2022. That's pretty good. 14.5 points per game. This is in your PPR leagues in 2023. I mean, that's fine, But that's not really what we think of when we think of Derrick Henry. And even beyond the declining fantasy production, he's been a declining running back just in production in general. You look at the last 3 years, he hasn't averaged more than 4.3 yards per carry in any of those seasons, and he doesn't catch a ton of passes, only had 12 catches this year, so you're not getting anything there. And you look at the fact that he's a 30-year-old running back with over 2,000 carries now. That is not a recipe for getting better. I can't even name a running back. I can't even think of a running back that was in their 30s with at least 2,000 carries and had one of their best seasons. Even Adrian Peterson couldn't do it. But what's also concerning to me is that last year, for only the second time in 5 years, he had less than 300 carries. And the last time he had less than 300 carries, it was because he missed half the season. He played every game last year and still only, I say only because it is a lot, but only had 280 carries. Maybe that's because the coaching staff of the Titans realized Derrick Henry is getting up there in age and usage and is wearing down, and now he's going to go to a new team more than likely. We don't know where that is. We don't know, is he going to be a workhorse? Is it going to be a run-friendly offense? Is it going to be a good offensive line? Is there going to be another good running back with him? I mean, there are a ton of red flags for Derrick Henry here. Look, I get it. It's Derrick Henry. He's the king. He's been great. You're going to see him in your drafts, and you're going to think, he's fine. He's okay here, and maybe he will be, but just don't expect vintage Derrick Henry probably ever again.
Now, last year, a very popular bounce-back candidate was Calvin Ridley, and he was bouncing back from not playing because he was suspended. So no injury history here. He's not old, still under 30, and he was going to be part of one of the most prolific passing offenses in Jacksonville. And it wasn't that great. I mean, he wasn't a bust, but he wasn't a league winner either. He was great sometimes, and he was bad some other times. And altogether, if you had Calvin Ridley, you basically wanted to buckle in and hold on because it was a roller coaster ride. Frustration a lot of times. I don't really know how to explain the Calvin Ridley experience last year except, well, it didn't look like Calvin Ridley that a lot of people expected. We might not see that again next year because he's probably not going to be in Jacksonville because, as it turns out, was part of this deal, if they extend him, then they're going to have to give up a second-round pick to Atlanta, and I'm pretty sure they're not going to do that. Now, he's going to hit the free agent market most likely. He could wind up back in Jacksonville if nobody wants to pay up for him. He could wind up going to some great offense, but really, what are the chances that a team is willing to take him on as the number one receiver? A team that already has a great quarterback in place, already is part of a prolific passing offense. I don't see it happening. Ridley just didn't prove that he's necessarily capable of being a number one guy in an offense that doesn't throw the ball a ton. He had his career year already when he was in his prime, age 27, when Atlanta was just throwing it and Julio Jones was injured. He only averaged not even 60 yards per game last year. Like I said, lots of ups and downs. In terms of efficiency, not better than Christian Kirk. We saw that offense really miss Christian Kirk when he was hurt. Calvin Ridley could not carry the load at receiver. He only wound up being 45th in terms of PFF receiving grade. That's below guys like Romeo Doubs. And you're telling me that some other team is going to say, hey, let's make him our alpha, our number one receiver. He's going to help us, carry us all the way through the playoffs. I just don't see it happening. So he's probably going to be a complimentary receiver again, probably in an offense that doesn't throw as much. And look, I think he's fine. Again, I'm not completely out on Calvin Ridley next year, but I think we've already seen the best Calvin Ridley has to offer, and I'm not willing to take the chance that he steps down another notch in terms of efficiency. All right, there's still warning signs for some players that you might find surprising. Who you got in mind?
Yeah, you say we might have seen the best of Calvin Ridley. I think we might have seen the best of DK Metcalf already, as crazy as that sounds. You go back 4 years ago, year two, DK Metcalf, over 1,300 yards, averaged 17 PPR points per game, looked like he was going to be one of the stud, elite, alpha wide receivers for years to come. And then the last 3 years, what has he done? 14 points per game, 13 points per game, 14 points per game, barely over 1,100 yards one year, not even 1,000 yards one year. I mean, he's been good, but that's it. He's just been kind of good as a wide receiver, but he still has this, aura about him that he's this elite fantasy stud, elite real life stud wide receiver, and it's just not there. And you look at last year, He only went over 20 PPR points twice the whole season. He only went over 16 PPR points 4 times. And we talked a lot about the warning signals last year. Number one, Geno Smith. Was he going to be as good as he was the prior year? He wasn't. He was still okay, but he certainly wasn't as good as he was the year prior. They had drafted Jackson Smith-Njigba. And look, Jackson Smith-Njigba wasn't even the guy we expected him to be, but he still ate into DK Metcalf's production. And now Jackson Smith-Njigba going into year 2, probably going to be more involved. And Tyler Lockett still has 2 more years on his contract, so he's not going anywhere. How is DK Metcalf going to get even better now? If he hasn't gotten better than he was in year 2 the last 3 years, why would it happen now? What situation is different? There's still a lot of red flags that signal DK Metcalf will probably be fine this year. He'll probably be good. But is that really what you want? Especially for a guy who is still viewed as an early round pick, who is still viewed as an elite wide receiver? I mean, if I could get DK Metcalf in like round 6 or round 7, okay, but I got to draft this guy in like round 3. I don't understand why. Way too many red flags here. Hasn't even been that good the last 3 years. DK Metcalf, to me, just way too many warning signs and red flags to take him as high as he's going.
All right, now, if those picks didn't raise eyebrows, how about this? I know I'll get some hate for this pick, but how about George Kittle? Maybe being a little overrated, maybe on the decline. Look, great player, and I get it. I actually was shocked to realize that at the end of the year, he finished as the tight end number 5 in PPR scoring, because it didn't really feel like that. But I think, again, that has more to do with the tight end position than with him doing anything amazing. So, sure, he had his moments, and hey, the best thing is he actually did play a full season, didn't miss a bunch of games like he has in the past. But when you look at it, it kind of feels a little hollow at the end of the day. And if you had Kittle, you know what I'm talking about. He had some ups and some downs. This happens in football. Every player goes through this, but his were a little more extreme. He had that 3-touchdown game early in the season, had a couple of big games toward the second half, but he only wound up with 6 games where he went over 10 fantasy points. That means more than half the time, he's disappointing you because you drafted him as a top 5 tight end and probably way earlier than you should have. I kind of made the mistake 2 years ago of going all in on Kittle. I was too high on him. I felt like, I didn't have to draft a tight end in the first or second round. I still get a stud in round 5 or 6. It didn't really help me. And so last year I was like, I'm done drafting guys like this in the middle rounds. I'm just going to either draft early or I'm going to wait on tight end. I had no Kittle last year. And I'm actually pretty happy that I wound up doing that. Look, George Kittle is still a good player. He's still in a good offense. But we have to realize that he's not necessarily an elite player who's going to carry your team in fantasy. He's still competing for targets with Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk. Yes, he'll probably still be in San Francisco next year. Christian McCaffrey, Juwan Jennings. There are all sorts of options here. George Kittle hasn't hit 100 targets in a season since 2019. And I'll tell you what, that 2019 season when he was breaking records and was an elite tight end, he hasn't matched it since then, and I'm pretty sure he's not going to match it again. So he will continue to be a good tight end, but there are some red flags here. Again, another year of experience is fine for a tight end, right? He's not like a running back who's going to wear down, but this isn't going to help his stock anymore. I think he's still just getting by on name value alone. I think that there's too much volatility here. You got to dig deeper in the stats and realize this isn't the elite fantasy player that you're hoping for when you draft him early. Those are some big name players that have some red flags, but these guys could just outright be busts.